The day Grace Archer walked into Salvation Creek, she had 37 cents in her coat pocket, a bruise yellowing along her left jaw that she refused to explain to anyone, and a pride so fierce and so bone-deep that it had kept her upright through things that would have broken a lesser woman clean in two. Salvation Creek, Texas, 1882, was the kind of town that seemed to have grown up out of the dust rather than been built by human hands, a scattering of sun-bleached buildings along a single main road that the locals called Meridian Street, though no map in existence had ever bothered to name it. There was a general store run by a German immigrant named Herschel Baumann, who spoke English well enough when he wanted to, and not at all when he did not. There was a barber shop, a livery, a small church whose congregation had dwindled to 11 souls since the new reverend arrived, a jailhouse that doubled as the sheriff's office, and at the far end of the street, half hidden behind a pair of old cottonwood trees that somehow still found water enough to survive, there was the Red Lantern, which was at once a saloon, an eating house, and a boarding establishment, though not necessarily in that order of importance. Grace had walked 7 miles from the crossroads where the stagecoach driver had set down her single carpet bag and informed her, without particular apology, that the line did not continue to Salvation Creek proper, and that she would have to make her own way from there. She had thanked him with a civility she did not feel, picked up her bag, and walked. She was 24 years old. Her boots had a crack along the right sole that let in the Texas dust with every step. Her dress had once been a deep burgundy, but had faded in patches to the color of old brick. Her dark hair was pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that was slightly too large for her head, and it slid forward when she walked into the wind, which she corrected each time with a sharp, practiced motion that had become as automatic as breathing. She was not going to let anyone in this town see her falter. She had made that decision somewhere around the 3rd mile, when her stomach had contracted with a pain that was honest hunger rather than nerves, and she had forced herself to walk a little straighter as punishment for the weakness of the feeling. She had come to Salvation Creek because there was nowhere else left to go. Her husband, Thomas Archer, had died 14 months ago of a fever that took him in 4 days when he had seemed perfectly well on a Monday morning, and was in the ground by that Friday. He had left behind a farm outside of Abilene that had been mortgaged against a loan that Grace had not known existed, and when the bank sent its man, she had learned that the farm was not hers and had never truly been theirs. She had packed what she could carry. She had moved into a room above a milliner's shop in Abilene proper and had worked there, trimming hats and taking in alterations, for nearly a year. The woman who owned the shop, a Mrs. Farrow, was not unkind, but she was practical, and when her nephew came back from St. Louis needing work, Grace's position was given to him. There were other things that happened in Abilene after that, things Grace did not speak of, that had produced the bruise on her jaw and the decision to climb aboard a stagecoach heading southwest with 37 cents, and the understanding that pride was the only currency she had left that no one could take from her. She had heard about Salvation Creek from a woman on the stage who said there was a dressmaker's trade to be had there, that the town was growing, that a clever woman with a needle could make a decent life. The woman had gotten off the stage 2 stops earlier and had waved goodbye with a cheerful confidence that Grace now suspected had very little basis in fact. Still, she was here, and she was not going back. The main street of Salvation Creek was quiet in the midday heat. A dog slept under the porch of the general store. 2 men sat in chairs outside the barber shop with their hats pulled down over their eyes, and Grace could not tell whether they were awake or asleep. She walked the length of the street slowly, not because she was tired, though she was, but because she was reading every sign, every window, every small indication of whether this town had room for her. She found the Red Lantern and pushed through its front door. The interior was dim after the blaze of the Texas sun, and Grace stood in the doorway for a moment while her eyes adjusted. The room smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and something faintly sweet that she eventually identified as apple cider vinegar, which someone was using to wipe down the bar. The bar itself ran along the left wall, and behind it stood a woman of about 50 with gray-streaked red hair pinned up in a no-nonsense bun, and an expression that suggested she had seen everything at least twice and had developed opinions about most of it. "You looking to rent or looking to eat?" the woman said, not unpleasantly. "I'm looking for work," Grace said. She kept her voice even. She was aware that she looked as though she had walked 7 miles in the Texas dust because she had, and she was aware that the bruise on her jaw was visible, and she was aware that none of this was the impression she would have chosen to make. But she was here and she was asking, and that was what there was. The woman looked at her steadily for a moment. "I'm Mabel Trent. I run this place." "Grace Archer. You sew, cook, pour drinks without spilling." "I sew. I can help with cooking. I'd rather not pour drinks, but I understand if it's part of the position." Mabel set down her cloth and crossed her arms. "You got somewhere to stay?" "Not yet." Mabel studied her for another long moment, the kind of thorough assessment that took in the cracked boot sole and the too large hat and the precise, careful way Grace was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "I've got a room upstairs that's empty. Basic sewing and mending for the girls here, plus whatever I need mended for the household. Meals included with the room. $2 a week on top of that." It was not much. It was, in fact, barely anything. But the meals included with the room were the detail that lodged itself in Grace's chest like a warm stone, because she had not eaten since yesterday morning, and her 37 cents would not go far enough to correct that situation. "That sounds acceptable," Grace said. "I'd like to see the room." "Follow me," Mabel said, already moving toward the staircase at the back. Grace picked up her carpet bag and followed, and she did not allow herself to feel relief until she was alone in the small room upstairs with the door closed, at which point she sat down on the narrow bed and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and breathed. The room had a window that looked out over the side of the building toward a yard where a horse was tied to a fence post, and a man was working at a chopping block, splitting firewood with clean, efficient strokes. Grace watched him for a moment before she pulled herself back to the business of unpacking her carpet bag, which did not take long. She had a change of dress, her sewing kit, a Bible with her mother's name written on the inside cover, a small daguerreotype of Thomas that she placed face down in the drawer of the bedside table without quite being able to make herself throw it away, and a bar of lavender soap that was her one extravagance, which she set on the windowsill where it could catch the air. She would need to understand this town. She would need to find more work than what Mabel was offering. $2 a week would cover soap and thread and new boot soles eventually, but it would not build anything. Grace had learned the difference between surviving and building, and she intended to build, even if she had to start from the barest possible foundation. She washed her face in the basin, repinned her hair, and went back downstairs. Isaiah Holloway was 30 years old and had run his cattle operation, the H-Bar Ranch, for 6 years, since his father had handed it to him, and retired to San Antonio to live with his sister in what he called civilized comfort, and what Isaiah privately considered a slow death by domesticity. He was not a man who spoke much, which some people in Salvation Creek took for coldness and others took for wisdom, and the truth was somewhere between those two interpretations and also not quite either of them. He spoke when he had something to say. When he did not have something to say, he was quiet. He had found over 30 years that this was a policy that served him better than its opposite. He had been coming to the Red Lantern for his noon meal 3 or 4 times a week for the better part of 2 years, ever since Mabel's cook, a Mexican woman named Rosario, had started making a beef stew with dried chilies, and common that Isaiah was honest enough with himself to admit was the best thing he had eaten in his adult life. He would come in, take the same table near the back window, eat his meal, pay Mabel, and leave. He exchanged pleasantries with Mabel and with the other regulars, and he did not get into other people's business. He was not unfriendly. He was simply a man who had found his groove in the world and did not see a particular reason to step out of it. He came in on the third day after Grace's arrival and found Mabel behind the bar with the expression she wore when something had just happened that she was reserving judgment on. He took his usual table. He ordered his usual stew. He looked out the window at Meridian Street and thought about the north pasture fence that needed repair before the fall. It was while he was thinking about the fence that he became aware of her. She was sitting at the small corner table near the staircase. Not the table she would have chosen if she had known the staircase traffic was constant, Isaiah noted, which meant she was still learning the room. She had a cup of coffee and a small piece of cornbread in front of her, and she was working through something in a small notebook with a stub of pencil, writing carefully and precisely. She did not look up. She did not appear to be aware of anyone else in the room. She had the concentrated stillness of a person who has trained herself not to be distracted by the environment around her, because too much awareness of the environment leads too quickly to awareness of the people in it, and the people in it have opinions, and she had had enough of other people's opinions to last a considerable time. Isaiah did not stare. He ate his stew and watched the street and went back to thinking about the fence. He noticed, though, because he was a man who noticed things without making a production of it, that the cornbread was very small and the coffee was very thin, and that she ate and drank with the precise economy of a person rationing. He did not comment on this. It was not his business. He paid for his meal, nodded to Mabel, and left. He came back 2 days later, and she was at the same corner table with the same notebook and a bowl of something that looked like it had more water than substance, and she was eating it with the same careful deliberation, not looking up, not inviting conversation or sympathy or anything else from the room. Over the next week, Isaiah formed a picture from the pieces available to him. He learned from Mabel, who volunteered the basic facts without embellishment, that Grace Archer was a widow who had come to town looking for sewing work. He learned from Herschel Bauman, who was more expansive by nature, that she had come into the general store and priced out thread and fabric with the detailed attention of someone working out a budget to the last cent. He learned from Jimmy Crane, the town's self-appointed news service who spent most of his day in the barbershop absorbing information and redistributing it, that the widow Archer had spoken to 3 of the town's households about taking in sewing and had gotten tentative agreements from 2 of them. Isaiah did not ask about her. The information simply accumulated the way information does in a small town, settling around a new person like sediment settling around a new stone dropped into water. What he had worked out on his own, without any help from the town's information network, was that she was hungry in a way she would rather die than admit. He knew what managed hunger looked like. He had seen it on his own face in the mirror during a bad winter 5 years ago when the cattle had not sold at any price worth speaking of, and he had eaten less than he should have for 3 months rather than borrow against the ranch and risk losing it the way his neighbor, poor Danton Wells, had lost his. There was a specific quality of attention a hungry person gave to food. There was a specific way they held the utensil. There was a specific stillness that Grace Archer had when the food arrived that was not pleasure, or not only pleasure, but something closer to relief, and he recognized it the way you recognize something you have felt in your own body. She was too proud to say anything about it. That much was absolutely clear. She was doing this on her own, and she was not asking for anything, and she was managing, and she would continue to manage, because the alternative to managing was unacceptable to her, and she had decided that approximately before she walked into this town. Isaiah sat with this knowledge for a few days, and then he did something about it. He spoke to Rosario first, explaining what he wanted. Rosario looked at him for a moment with the expression she reserved for things that surprised her, which was not many things, and then she nodded and did not make a remark about it, for which he was grateful. It was a Wednesday midday, and the Red Lantern had its usual scattering of people. Grace was at her corner table with the notebook, and in front of her was a tin mug of coffee, black and nothing else. She had her head down and she was writing something in the notebook with the focused, private intensity of someone who is not intending to stop for lunch. Isaiah ate his stew. He finished. He said something quiet to Rosario, who came out from the kitchen with a second plate, a full plate, beef and potatoes and a thick slab of bread with butter going soft in the noon heat, and a wedge of dried apple pie on a separate, smaller plate. Isaiah carried it across the room himself. He set it down on the table in front of Grace without a word, without making eye contact, without pausing to gauge her reaction or wait for her thanks or engage in any exchange whatsoever. He simply set the plate down and walked away, back to his table and sat down and looked out the window at the street. Grace went very still. He did not look at her. He looked at the street. He was aware, with a peripheral attention he was not going to act on, that she had looked up sharply when the plate appeared, and that she had looked across the room at him, and that he had given her nothing to engage with, no look, no gesture, no opening for the conversation where she would explain that she was fine, thank you. She did not need charity. She had her own means. He had taken that conversation away from her before she could have it, and he knew it, and he was not going to apologize for it. He heard, after a long moment, the quiet sound of a spoon being picked up. He kept looking at the street. When he left, 20 minutes later, he glanced at the corner table in the way you glance at something when you are trying to appear not to look at it. The plate was empty. The pie plate was empty. Grace was writing in her notebook again with the same focused precision as before, but there was something subtly different about the set of her shoulders. A very slight release, like a string that has been tuned down half a note, that told him that the food had reached the place in her that it needed to reach. He went back to the H-bar and did not think about her with any particular intensity for the rest of the afternoon. He thought about the fence. He had his supper and checked on the horses and went to bed at a reasonable hour. The next morning he found a folded piece of paper that had been slipped under the bunkhouse door. He opened it. It was written in a precise, educated hand, the kind of hand that had been drilled by a particular sort of schooling. It said, "I do not know what arrangement you made with the kitchen and I do not know your name, but I know what the plate cost and I will repay it when I am able. I am not a charity case. I am a woman with prospects. G.A." Isaiah read it twice. He folded it back up and put it in his shirt pocket. He found himself with something that was not quite a smile but was in the same territory. He wrote back on the reverse side of the paper, "Isaiah Holloway, H-Bar Ranch, north of town. The plate cost nothing that can be repaid in money, so put that out of your mind. I have seen hungry before and it is not a judgment. If you want to make something even, I have 3 shirts that need mending that I have been putting off for 2 months because I can't make a decent stitch to save my life. Take the work or don't. I.H." He sealed the note in an envelope and left it with Mabel with instructions to give it to Mrs. Archer. Grace read the note standing in the hallway outside her room with the composed expression of someone who is feeling considerably more than their composed expression is letting on. She read it twice. She folded it precisely and put it in the pocket of her dress. She stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at the wall. She went into her room, got out her sewing kit and thought. The pride in her was like a physical structure, something she had built over years of necessity, and it told her that accepting anything she had not earned, even framed as work, was a diminishment. But the honest part of her, the part that was not pride but was something more fundamental and clear-eyed, told her that the man had seen her situation and had offered her dignity instead of pity, and that these were not the same thing at all. The shirts were real work. She would do real work. She sent word with Mabel that she would be at the Red Lantern Thursday morning if Mr. Holloway cared to bring the shirts. Isaiah brought 3 shirts on Thursday morning and also, perhaps with slightly more deliberateness than was strictly necessary, chose to eat his noon meal at the Red Lantern that day, timing it so that he arrived while Grace was still there. She was at the corner table with the shirts spread out in front of her, examining them with the particular professional attention of someone who knows exactly what they are looking at. She had a small threaded needle tucked behind her ear, the way a carpenter keeps a pencil. She was making notes in that notebook. Isaiah hung his hat on the peg by the door and took his usual table and ordered his stew, and the small theater of these ordinary actions was, he was aware, the most deliberate thing he had done in recent memory. Mabel brought his stew and raised both eyebrows at him in a way that communicated several things without requiring any of them to be said out loud. He ignored the eyebrows. After about 10 minutes, Grace looked up from the shirts. "The collar on the gray one is more than mending. The fabric has worn through. I'd need to replace it entirely, which means I'll need to source matching fabric from Mr. Bauman's." "All right," Isaiah said. "That will cost more than a standard mending fee." "All right." Grace looked at him. It was, he noticed, a very direct look. She was not a woman who communicated through indirection. "You're very agreeable." "About shirts," he said. There was a pause. Then, with a precision that he was beginning to understand was one of her characteristic modes of expression, she said, "Thank you, for the other day." "You already thanked me in the note." "I thanked you and also told you I wasn't a charity case." "I know, both things can be true at once." She looked at him a moment longer, then looked back at the shirts. "I'll have these done by Saturday, minus the gray collar, which will take until next week once I've sourced the fabric." "No hurry," he said. "There's always hurry," she said, which was not precisely an answer to what he had said but told him something more accurate than an answer would have. He came back Saturday for the 2 completed shirts and found her in a more expansive mood, or what he was coming to understand was expansive for Grace Archer, which meant she looked directly at him when she spoke and did not calibrate every sentence to its minimum necessary length. She had made friends with Mabel's youngest boarder, a cheerful girl named Lucy who worked in the saloon portion of the Red Lantern, and had a talent for telling stories about the other patrons that Grace found either entertaining or instructive. She was not always sure which. "Lucy tells me you are considered one of the more reliable men in the county," Grace said, counting out his change on the table with careful accuracy. "That's a low bar in some counties," Isaiah said. "True," she agreed. "But I've been told you deal honestly with your hands and your neighbors, you pay your debts, and you don't drink more than is socially customary." Lucy said all that. Lucy is very informative. What else did Lucy say? Grace looked up from the change. She had a way of considering whether to answer something that involved a slight tilt of her head, barely perceptible, that he had started noticing. "She said you have not courted anyone in Salvation Creek in the 2 years you have been eating your noon meal here, and that several people have expressed curiosity about why." "And what did Lucy say in response to that curiosity?" "She said she didn't know and it wasn't her business." Grace pushed the coins toward him across the table. "She also said she suspected you were simply the kind of man who does not do things until he is ready to do them." Isaiah looked at the coins and then at Grace. "Lucy is observant." "She is," Grace agreed. She did not ask any follow-up questions, and she did not press the subject, and she did not look at him with anything other than the same direct, clear attention she gave everything. But the conversation had established something. He was not sure yet what exactly, but something. He began coming into the Red Lantern 4 times a week instead of 3, and he would not have said why if pressed, but the honest answer was that the corner table was a better table than he had previously given it credit for. Over the following weeks, Grace built herself a small, solid enterprise. She took in mending from 4 households in Salvation Creek, including the Bauman family, whose 4 children were hard on their clothes in the way that children who climb things always are. She found that the women of the town were less interested in the complicated dress alterations she could do and more interested in the practical. Hems, buttons, torn seams, and the steady mending work that accumulated in any household. She charged fair prices, which were not the highest prices she could have charged but were the prices that would bring people back, and she noted carefully in her notebook the income and the expense, and the slow, gradual accumulation of something that was beginning to resemble stability. She paid Isaiah for the gray shirt fabric herself when she found a matching piece in Bauman's, refusing his offer to cover it with the same polite implacability she brought to most things she had decided. She paid him for the first 2 shirts as well, calculating the time and labor with scrupulous accuracy, and he accepted the payment without argument because he had read her correctly enough to understand that this was the only form of the transaction she would accept. He asked her once, on a Thursday at noon, how long she had been sewing. "My mother taught me when I was 6, she said. She had trained as a seamstress in Virginia before she came west. She said it was the one skill that could never be taken from you." Was she right? Grace considered this. Mostly. Other things can be taken, the skill remains. She picked up her coffee cup. "She died when I was 14. My father remarried the following year, and I had a stepmother who was not interested in teaching me other things. So I learned most of what I know either from my mother's example or from reading and practicing on my own." Isaiah had noticed that she spoke about difficult things with the same even tone she used for practical matters, as if having learned that emotion attached to the recounting of facts did not change the facts and was therefore optional. He had also noticed that underneath this evenness there was something she was keeping very carefully in place. "Where did you grow up?" he asked. "Missouri mostly, then Kansas." She looked at him over the coffee cup. "You?" "Here mostly. My family came down from Tennessee when I was 2. I don't remember Tennessee. Do you miss it?" "You can't miss what you never knew. Some people think you can," she said. "Some people spend their whole lives missing a version of things that never actually existed." "Do you?" She set the cup down. "No, I am better with what is in front of me than with what might have been." He thought about that for most of the afternoon. There was something in the straightness of her self-assessment that he found. He turned the word over carefully, clarifying. Like the moment when you adjust the bead on a rifle sight and the target suddenly occupies exactly the space it is supposed to occupy. The town, because it was a small town and small towns had their own economy of attention, had begun to notice that Isaiah Holloway was spending more time at the Red Lantern, and that the widow Archer was spending more time there too, and that these 2 facts were not unrelated. This information passed through Jimmy Crane's barbershop and Mabel's saloon and Bauman's general store with the reliability of a postal service, generating the usual variety of opinion. Mabel, who was the person whose opinion on this subject was most informed, said nothing to anyone, which was unusual enough to generate commentary of its own. Grace knew people were watching. She had been watched all her life in one way or another, and she had developed a complete indifference to it that was so thoroughgoing it had become genuine rather than performed. She talked to Isaiah because she found him interesting, which she had not expected to find a rancher from the Texas hills, and because he did not talk at her or through her or past her the way most men talk to women, but instead seemed to be conducting what she could only describe as an actual conversation, which was rarer than it had any right to be. She had not intended to like him. She had come to Salvation Creek to establish herself, to build the stability that had been denied her in Abilene, to be answerable to no one and dependent on no one. She had a husband once, and the husband had left her with nothing except a clear lesson about the risks of building your life on someone else's foundation, and she had absorbed that lesson completely. But Isaiah Holloway did not feel like a foundation in that way. He felt like she was in her room at the end of a Thursday, looking out the window at the yard, and she was thinking about this with the honest, exacting attention she gave to everything. He felt like a person who was simply standing where he was standing and would continue to stand there regardless of whether she decided to stand near him or not. There was no pressure in him. There was no performance of virtue or gentleness designed to extract something from her. He had set a plate of food in front of her when she was hungry and walked away without expecting anything in return, and that one act, so simple, so entirely without self-congratulation, had lodged itself in her understanding of him as something fundamental. She still thought about that moment, the plate appearing, his broad back retreating to his table. The way he had looked out the window as if the question of whether she ate or did not eat was entirely her own, and he had simply made the option available. It was the most respectful thing anyone had done for her in years, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. November came in cold with a blue norther that swept down from the panhandle and sent the temperature plummeting in the space of an afternoon. Salvation Creek pulled its shutters and banked its fires and settled in for the kind of cold that was not dangerous but was insistent, the kind that crept under doors and found the places where the mortar had cracked between the boards and reminded you, persistently, that the outdoors was enormous and the indoors were very small. Grace's room was cold. The Red Lantern's building was old enough that the seams were drafty, and while Mabel kept a good fire going in the common room downstairs, the upper floor was a different matter. Grace had 2 blankets on the bed and wore her coat inside until she went to sleep, and she did not mention it to Mabel because it was fine and she was managing. Isaiah had come in on the day the norther arrived with the air of a man who had checked on livestock and fencing in 30-degree wind, and was now prepared to be civil about it. He had sat down at the back table, and Rosario had brought his stew without being asked, and he had eaten half of it before he had warmed up enough to notice that Grace was working with her fingers curled tightly around the pen instead of their usual fluid grip, which was what hands do when they are cold. He thought about whether to say anything. He decided against it and then changed his mind. "Is your room warm enough?" he asked. She looked up. "It's fine." "Your hands are stiff." She straightened them deliberately and set the pen down. "They warm up." He looked at her for a moment. "Mabel has extra blankets in the storage room off the kitchen. She would not mind if you asked." "I did not say I needed blankets." "No, you said your hands warm up." He went back to his stew. "I'm just noting that Mabel has them." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why do you notice these things?" He considered the question. "It's a habit," he said finally. "On a ranch you learn to notice when something needs attention before it becomes a problem. People aren't so different from property in that way." "I'm not property." "No," he said, without any particular emphasis or apology. "You're not." She looked at him for another moment and then, with the air of someone making a very minor capitulation, she said, "I suppose there is no harm in asking Mabel about blankets." She asked Mabel. Mabel produced 3 blankets and an explanation about why she had not thought to offer them earlier that was entirely gracious and required no apology from anyone. That evening Grace slept warmer than she had since arriving in Salvation Creek, and she lay in the dark and listened to the wind working at the building and thought, without having intended to think it, about Isaiah Holloway's hands, which were large and weathered and careful, and about the way he had noticed her stiff fingers without making anything of it, and she pressed her face into the warm blanket and felt something she would need a few more days to name. The Christmas season brought the Red Lantern its busiest period of the year, when the ranching families came into town for supplies, and the merchants put on their best faces, and there was a social at the church hall that everyone attended regardless of their relation to the church's theology. Mabel arranged to have the Red Lantern's main room cleared for a smaller gathering of her own on Christmas Eve, with Rosario cooking for 2 days in advance, and Lucy playing the piano that lived in the corner and was somewhat out of tune but enthusiastic. Grace had made herself a new collar from a piece of cream-colored lawn she had found among Bauman's remnants, and she had pressed her best dress and pinned her hair up in a way she had not tried since Abilene. And she sat at Mabel's Christmas Eve gathering feeling something she was careful to identify accurately as cautious happiness rather than happiness, because accuracy about her own states had proven protective in the past. Isaiah came late, having ridden in from the ranch through the cold dark with his second man, a lean Tejano named Andres who danced with 3 different women before the evening, was an hour old, and made the whole room laugh with a story about a bull that had gotten loose on the main street of a town farther south. Isaiah sat with Mabel and talked about the range conditions and the expected prices for the spring sale, and Grace watched the fire and listened to Lucy play and felt the warmth of the room begin to soften something in her that had been held tight for a very long time. Isaiah eventually made his way across the room and sat down in the chair beside her. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Archer," he said. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Holloway," she said. They sat in the way that two people sit when they have become comfortable enough together that silence is not an awkwardness but a texture. Lucy was playing something slow and slightly uncertain on the piano, feeling out a melody she knew but had not practiced recently. Andres was at the bar with a glass of Mabel's cider, still entertaining people with his stories. "Do you have family you are missing tonight?" Isaiah asked. "My mother has been gone for 10 years, Grace said. "My father and I are not in close contact. I had a sister, but she died of cholera when we were young." She said these things simply, without burdening them with emotion that she did not feel she had the right to perform. "I spent last Christmas with a woman in Abilene who was kind to me. I suppose I am doing the same this year in a different form." "Mabel is good people," he agreed. "She is." Grace looked at the fire. "Do you have family nearby?" "My father is in San Antonio. He comes up once a year or sends a letter if the year is busy. I have a sister in Tennessee. She married a man with a tobacco farm. She writes more regularly than my father." "Do you miss having family clothes?" He thought about this. "Sometimes, mostly in the winter. Summer and fall there's enough work that you don't notice gaps. And spring," he looked at her. There was something in his face behind the habitual evenness that she was getting better at reading. "Spring is hopeful," he said, which was not quite an answer to the question but was true in a way she understood. Lucy found the melody she had been looking for on the piano, and the music became something you could almost dance to. Andres pulled Mabel herself up from her chair, despite her protests and her laughter, and danced her around the cleared floor with a formality that suggested he had been taught by someone who took dancing seriously. Isaiah stood up and extended his hand to Grace. She looked at the hand. She looked at him. She thought about the number of decisions she had made in the last 6 months that had felt like giving something up and had turned out to be receiving something she had not known she was missing. She put her hand in his and stood up. They danced with the careful attention of two people who are trying very hard not to think about the fact that they are dancing, which of course means they are thinking about nothing else. His hand on her back was a light pressure, respectful of every boundary she had not stated, but that he seemed to read with the same attention he gave to everything else. She was aware of the warmth of him, the physical solidity of him, the fact that she was the same height as his shoulder, and that this was an entirely comfortable height to be. When the music ended, she stepped back and he let her, and they stood for a moment in the small cleared space of Mabel's Christmas room with something between them that had moved slightly, like furniture that has been shifted an inch, and you can tell by the mark on the floor that it has been in a different place. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he said. She went to bed that night with the warm blankets and the lavender soap smell and the memory of his hand at the small of her back, and she let herself feel what she felt rather than examining it into pieces, because it was Christmas Eve and the wind had stopped, and Salvation Creek was quiet, and she was warm. In January, a man came to Salvation Creek who was trouble from the first moment he stepped off his horse. His name was Reeves, first name either not given or not remembered, and he had a claim on a piece of land east of town that was being disputed by 2 other parties, which was the kind of dispute that in 1882 in the hill country of Texas could go several ways, most of them involving lawyers or guns or both. He moved into the Red Lantern, because there was nowhere else in town to stay, and he drank at Mabel's bar in the evening with the focused determination of a man who is trying to achieve a specific state rather than simply enjoy himself. Grace found him unsettling in a way she recognized from a particular kind of experience, and she arranged her schedule so that she was not in the common room when he was drinking in the evenings. She mentioned this to no one because she did not think it had yet risen to the level of something that required mention. She mentioned it to Isaiah obliquely one Thursday at noon, saying that she supposed Mabel had interesting tenants from time to time. Isaiah set down his spoon. "The Reeves fellow," she looked at him. "You know about him. His land dispute is the talk of the county. There are 3 parties claiming the same parcel, and at least 2 of them are willing to get very unpleasant about it." He looked at her carefully. "Has he said something to you?" "Nothing specific. He's simply the sort of man who takes up a great deal of space." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If he says something specific, I would like to know." "It is not your concern," she said automatically, because this was the reflex, and then she heard herself and added more quietly, "But I would tell you, if it became something." He nodded. He picked up his spoon again. The matter was set aside, but not dismissed, which was the way he handled things, and which she had come to recognize and trust. Reeves left Salvation Creek 3 weeks later, having resolved his land claim in a way that the county recorder described as legally technical, and that Jimmy Crane described in the barbershop as the kind of thing that ought to have more of a story to it than it apparently did. He left on a Tuesday morning without incident, which was disappointing to the people who had expected drama, and a relief to the people who had not wanted it. Grace resumed her full use of the common room without mentioning that she had ever restricted it. February was quiet and cold and gray, and Grace noticed that she had begun to watch for Isaiah's horse outside the Red Lantern, in the way you watch for something you have been expecting without having admitted to yourself that you are expecting it. The bay gelding with the white stocking on his left foreleg, tied at the post outside while its owner ate his noon stew and talked to Grace about things that were somehow both ordinary and entirely sufficient. The fence repairs were going well. She had taken on a new mending client, the doctor's wife, who was meticulous about her requests and paid on the day rather than at the end of the month, which Grace appreciated. The spring sale at the livestock market was going to be interesting, because the drought further south had pushed cattle prices in a direction that was either good or bad depending on which side of the transaction you were standing on. She had begun to wonder whether there was enough demand in Salvation Creek for a proper dressmaking service rather than simply mending, and she was thinking about whether to approach the matter directly or to test it gradually. "Directly," Isaiah said. "Why directly?" "Because you are better at direct than at gradual. Gradual requires a different kind of patience than you have." She considered being offended by this and then considered that it was simply accurate. What kind of patience do I have? The kind that keeps things going indefinitely once they are started, not the kind that waits to start them. She looked at him across the table. "That is a surprisingly perceptive observation." "I'm occasionally perceptive," he said. "Occasionally," she agreed, and felt herself smiling in a way that was not careful or managed but simply was, which happened with him more than it had happened with anyone in a long time. She went to speak to the women of the town directly and found, to her satisfaction and also somewhat to her surprise, that there was indeed a market for proper dressmaking. 3 women placed orders in the first week. Grace spent 2 evenings at the desk in her room reorganizing her notebook, planning her approach, calculating costs and time frames with the pleasure of someone who is good at a thing and knows they are good at it. She was going to need more equipment. She had been managing with her own kit and the occasional use of Mabel's scissors, but if she was going to take on dress work in volume, she needed a larger table and better shears, and a measuring tape that was not slightly inaccurate at the 30-inch mark. She had money saved now, enough to buy these things without distress, but the buying of them felt significant in a way that was hard to put precisely into words. It was the buying of permanence. It was the declaration, in the language of objects and expense, that she was not passing through Salvation Creek, but was instead choosing it. She bought the shears first, from Bauman's catalog, because they were the most important, and when they arrived, she held them in her hand in the street outside the general store, and felt something settle in her chest with the weight and finality of a decision completely made. She ran into Isaiah coming out of the feed merchant next door. which was not as much of a coincidence as it might seem given that they both inhabited the same half-mile of Meridian Street and tended to be in town on the same days. She held up the shears. He looked at them. New, she confirmed. Wis brand, best available. She turned them in the light with a satisfaction that she did not try to moderate. He looked at her face rather than the shears. "You look pleased," he observed. "I am pleased," she said simply. They stood on Meridian Street in the February cold with the feed merchant on one side and Bauman's on the other, and the bare cottonwoods at the end of the street showing their dark winter shapes against the pale sky. And Isaiah looked at her with the full, clear attention she had grown accustomed to and somewhat undone by, and he said, "Mrs. Archer, I would very much like to call on you if you are willing." The street was quiet. There was the distant sound of Bauman's door opening and closing. A dog was investigating something under the porch of the barber shop. "Call on me," she repeated, not as a question but as something she was placing in front of herself to examine. "Yes." She held the shears in both hands. She thought about the plate he had set down in front of her and walked away from without waiting for thanks. She thought about the note about the shirts. She thought about the blankets and her stiff, cold fingers and a Christmas dance and the word spring and how he had said it. She thought about his bay horse outside the Red Lantern and the notebook and the conversations that had been, from the very beginning, a form of being seen, which was what she had been most afraid of, and also, she understood now, what she had most wanted. "Yes," she said, "I think I would like that." His expression changed in the way she had come to watch for, that small, unmistakable shift behind the habitual stillness. "Sunday, then," he said, "if the weather holds." "If the weather holds," she agreed. The weather held. He came on Sunday afternoon with his good hat on and his boots cleaned, which she noticed and appreciated without commenting on, and they walked to the end of Meridian Street and along the creek bed that gave the town its name. A thin trickle of water between limestone banks that in spring apparently ran full and clear, but in February was doing its best under the circumstances. They talked for 2 hours, and it felt like 20 minutes, and it felt like a week, the way time does when it is being used properly. He told her about the H-Bar Ranch more specifically than he had before. 2,000 acres of hill country, grass that was good in wet years and adequate in dry ones, a herd that he had been building slowly and carefully since his father left, a set of buildings that were solid and functional without being anything that would draw attention. He had a foreman now, a man named Gareth, who had been with him 4 years and was reliable enough to leave in charge when Isaiah needed to be away. He had 3 working hands, including Andres, who had been with him 6 years and was the best horseman he had ever met. She told him about Missouri and Kansas, about her mother's sewing and her father's restlessness, and the way the family had moved every few years for reasons that were never quite explained. She told him about the farm near Abilene, the marriage to Thomas, the way she had tried to make it work even as it became clearer that Thomas's relationship with money was the relationship of a man who believed, with sincere and unkillable optimism, that things would work out, and that this belief, however genuine, was not a financial plan. She told him about the mortgage and the bank and the milliner's shop, and she told him about leaving Abilene with the particular terseness of someone who is being honest without being complete, and he received the incompleteness without pressing at it, which she was grateful for. "You did not come to Salvation Creek because someone sent for you," he said. "You came because you had worked out it was the best available option and you acted on that." "Yes. And now?" She was looking at the creek, at the thin water moving between the pale stones. "Now I am determining whether it was the right choice or merely the best available option. Is there a difference?" "Yes," she said. "The best available option is what you take when you have no better choices. The right choice is what you would choose even if you did have other options." He was quiet for a moment. "And what's your current assessment?" She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that clear, complete attention that she had been on the receiving end of for months now and had still not entirely learned to meet without feeling something move inside her. I am becoming increasingly inclined to call it the right choice, she said. He held her gaze. I'm glad, he said, and there was nothing in those two words that was not exactly what they meant. Spring came to the hill country in the way that Texas spring always comes, which is to say suddenly and abundantly, as if the land has been waiting for permission. The creek behind Salvation Creek ran high and clear and cold, and the hills above town went green in what seemed like the space of a weekend, and the air smelled of cedar and new grass and the distant memory of last summer's heat. Grace's dressmaking business had by March established itself as a genuine enterprise. She had outgrown her room as a workspace, and had, after careful calculation and a frank conversation with Mabel about terms, rented the small room adjacent to the Red Lantern's back entrance that Mabel had been using for storage. She cleaned it out and whitewashed the walls and set up the large table she had bought second-hand from a woman 2 streets over who was moving to live with her daughter in Fort Worth. And she hung a lamp with a good glass chimney and placed the whisk shears where they caught the light. And she stood in the doorway and looked at the space and felt the word hers apply to it with a warmth that was slightly different in quality from anything she had felt before. Isaiah came by on a Saturday in March with a length of indigo blue wool that he had brought up from San Antonio on his last supply run. He held it out to her in the matter-of-fact way of a man who has thought about something and done it and is not going to make a performance of it. She took the wool and looked at it. It was good quality, well dyed, the color of deep water. For a dress, he said. I see that, she said. She ran her fingers along the edge of the fabric. Why indigo? He looked at her steadily. It matches how you look when you are thinking about something you are going to do, all that concentration, like deep water before a storm. She looked up at him. They were standing in the doorway of her new workroom with the spring morning behind him and the clean smell of whitewash and cedar in the air around her, and something in her chest had shifted so completely that it required a moment to recalibrate. She said, Isaiah, he said, Grace. She set the wool carefully on the table behind her and turned back to him. I have been very careful about this, she said. About all of it, about you. I know, he said. I have been careful because I learned to be careful. Because care is what you learn when things go wrong. When people disappoint you or leave you or she stopped, and then continued with the honest steadiness that was so entirely her own, when you learn that the only thing you can actually protect is yourself. Yes, he said. But, she said, and the word was a threshold, I think I have been applying the lesson past its usefulness. I think I learned to protect myself so well that I nearly kept out things I should have let in. She looked at him. You are a thing I should have let in sooner. He crossed the small threshold of the doorway. He was not a man who moved without intention, and the intention here was as clear as anything she had ever seen. He took her face in his hands carefully with the roughened palms that knew the grain of leather and wood and the particular weight of a day's hard work, and he looked at her for a moment before he said, I have been waiting to do this for a very long time. You should have been more impatient, she said. I didn't think you'd have thanked me for it. No, she admitted. I wouldn't have. He kissed her in the doorway of her workroom on a Saturday morning in March of 1882. And it was not a gentle or tentative kiss, though it was a careful one, the care not of uncertainty, but of the kind of attention you give to things that matter, and Grace felt it in every place where she had been held rigid for too long, and she let it move her, and she was not afraid. When he stepped back, she kept her hands against his chest for a moment, steadying herself or steadying him, or simply because she had not yet finished with the sensation of having his heartbeat under her palm. It was fast, she noticed. His heartbeat was fast. She found this satisfying in a deep and private way. You should come to the ranch, he said. When you have a day you can spare, I would like you to see it. Yes, she said. I would like that. She went on a Sunday in April, riding out with him in the morning on a horse Mabel's livery had in stock, a steady dun mare that she had ridden at a working trot along the track that led north from town into the hills. The H-Bar Ranch unfolded from the track as you came over a rise, and suddenly the country opened, and you could see the buildings below, and the pastures going up the hillsides, and the cattle moving slowly in the middle distance in the way cattle move when they have plenty of grass and no particular concerns. Isaiah showed her the buildings first, the main house, which was stone and timber and larger than she had pictured, solid and undecorated but clearly cared for, the barn, which was excellent, the bunkhouse where Andres and the hands lived, the small garden behind the kitchen that Rosario, who also cooked for the ranch on the days she was not at the Red Lantern, had planted with the ambition and determination of a woman who has strong opinions about vegetables. Then he showed her the land, riding out to the north pasture, and the creek that ran through the ranch's eastern edge, and the hill above the creek that looked out over the whole of his world in every direction. They sat up on that hill in the April sun, and the breeze came up from the valley, and Grace looked out over the hills going green and said, "It's beautiful." "Yes," he said. He was looking at her rather than the hills. "It is." She turned and caught him looking, and because she was Grace Archer and she had moved past the point of managing herself away from things she wanted, she did not look away. "I am going to tell you something," she said, "that I have been deciding whether to tell you for some weeks." "All right." "When I left Abilene," she said, "the reason I left with such urgency, the bruise on my face when I arrived here. That was from a man I had been briefly working for after the milliner's shop. He was not a decent man, and the situation became one I needed to leave immediately. I left without taking what he owed me, because leaving was more important than the money." Isaiah's expression had gone quiet and very still in the way that suggested a careful management of feeling. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said. "I don't want you to be sorry. I want you to know it because I am trying with you to be honest rather than simply private." "There's a difference," he said. "Yes, private is what I do when I'm protecting myself. Honest is what I do when I trust someone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very evenly, "The man in Abilene, did he face any consequence?" "Not from me," Grace said. "I thought briefly about it, but I had 37 cents in a carpet bag and a stagecoach to catch, and justice would have required staying, and staying was not possible." "No," he agreed. He looked out over the hills, then he looked back at her. "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for receiving it properly," she said. "Most people receive that kind of story in a way that makes it about their feelings rather than mine." "It is your story," he said simply. "I was just a listener." She leaned toward him on the hillside and kissed him first this time, which felt entirely different from being kissed, felt like the difference between traveling somewhere and arriving somewhere. And he put his arm around her, and they sat in the April sun on the hill above the H-bar, and were, for a significant while, not talking about anything at all. In May, Isaiah asked Mabel Trent for a private word and explained his intentions, and Mabel listened and then said, with the bluntness of a woman who has been providing room and board to people for 20 years and knows a good thing when she sees it, "Well, it's about time, and she's going to say yes, and I'll be sorry to lose her in my building, and if you don't treat her right, I will make your life genuinely unpleasant." Isaiah accepted these conditions. He asked Grace one evening in the workroom, where she was measuring a length of ivory muslin for the doctor's wife's spring dress. He came in and sat on the stool he had taken to occupying on the occasions when he came by while she was working, and he waited until she was at a stopping point and had looked up, and then he said, "I would like to marry you, Grace, if you want to." She set down the muslin and stood very still for a moment. "If I want to," she repeated. "Yes, not because it makes sense or because it's practical or because it solves a problem. Because I would like to build a life with you specifically, and because being around you makes me feel clearer about everything, including myself, and because I have been in love with you since approximately the third conversation we had and possibly before that, though I did not have a word for it at the time." Grace considered this carefully. She had known it was coming, had been feeling it accumulate the way weather accumulates before a storm, and she had thought about her answer from several angles over several weeks, because that was how she handled things. She had asked herself whether it was fear or wisdom that had made her hesitate, and had discovered, with the relentless accuracy she turned on herself, that it was neither. It was simply that she had wanted to be certain, and she was now certain. "Yes," she said, "I want to." He came off the stool in a single motion and crossed the small workroom in 2 steps and held her with the complete, unambiguous embrace of a man who has just been told the most important thing he has ever heard, and she pressed her face against the side of his neck and felt his heart beat fast and warm against her cheek and thought, "This is what it is supposed to feel like. This is what I had given up on." They were married in June at the small church in Salvation Creek, the congregation of which had grown somewhat since the new reverend proved to have more personality than initially advertised. Mabel came in her best dress and cried with the efficient dignity of a woman who was pleased, but unwilling to make a spectacle of herself. Andrés stood as Isaiah's witness and gave a toast in Spanish, and then in English that was both eloquent and unexpectedly moving. Rosario made a cake with dried fruits and honey that was the best thing Grace had ever eaten, and she said so. And Rosario looked pleased in the particular way of people who have been complimented on something they genuinely care about. Grace wore the indigo blue dress she had made from the wool Isaiah had brought her from San Antonio, fitted exactly to her measurements with every seam perfectly placed, the color against her dark hair and her skin exactly what he had said, exactly like deep water before a storm. Isaiah looked at her when she came down the aisle, and the look on his face was the look of a man who does not have words adequate to what he is feeling, and has given up trying to find them, which Grace, who understood the uses and limitations of language, found more moving than any words could have been. They moved to the H-Bar Ranch after the wedding. Grace kept the workroom at the Red Lantern and continued her dressmaking business, riding into town on a schedule she set for herself, answerable to no one but the clients who were waiting for their orders. Isaiah did not suggest any alteration to this arrangement. It had not occurred to him to suggest any alteration to this arrangement, which was one of the reasons she had said yes. The ranch house was bigger than the room above the Red Lantern, and Grace moved through it for the first week with the careful attention of someone learning a new language, identifying where things were, and where they should be, and which of the established arrangements were Isaiah's genuine preferences, and which were simply the defaults of a man who had lived alone for years, without anyone to discuss such things with. She moved a lamp and rehung a curtain, and put a pot of rosemary on the kitchen windowsill where it would get the morning light. And these small adjustments accumulated into the beginning of a home that was both of theirs together rather than his alone. They had their first genuine argument in July, about something that seemed small and turned out to be about larger things beneath the surface, as first arguments always are. It was about money, specifically about the ranch finances, specifically about the fact that Grace had looked at the account book and had identified 2 areas where the costs could be significantly reduced with changes to the current arrangement. And Isaiah had initially received this input with the subtle resistance of a man who has been managing his own affairs successfully for 6 years, and did not quite anticipate having them analyzed from the outside. "You are not wrong," he said eventually in the kitchen after a silence that had gone on long enough to require resolution. "I know I am not wrong," she said without triumph. He looked at her. "That is a very confident thing to say. It is an accurate thing to say. You are not wrong that you have run this ranch successfully. I am not wrong that these are better approaches in these 2 specific areas. Both things are true at once." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I am going to need some time to adjust to being told what to do in my own account book." "I am not telling you what to do," she said. "I am telling you what I see. The decision is yours." He thought about this. "The decision is ours," he said. "If we are doing this together, then the decisions are ours." The shift in his phrasing was not small, and he knew it, and she knew it, and they looked at each other across the kitchen in the July afternoon with that understanding between them, and then she said, "Then let's look at the account book together." And he said yes. And they did, and by the end of the evening had a plan that was considerably better than either version they had come in with individually. This became the pattern: two people who were each very good at what they did, learning to consult each other without losing themselves. It was not always smooth. Grace had her silences that were not peaceful but had to be waited out. Isaiah had a stubbornness that wore the costume of steadiness and was only identifiable as stubbornness when you had known him long enough to see it. They learned these things about each other with the patience of people who were building something they intended to keep. The fall of 1882 brought good cattle prices and Andres's wedding to a woman from a ranch south of town named Catalina, who arrived with strong opinions about everything and a smile that could stop a room, and Grace found her immediately interesting. The two women sat together at the wedding supper and talked for 3 hours about things ranging from the price of fabric in San Antonio to the specific difficulties of managing a household on a working ranch to the absolute necessity of having work that was your own. Isaiah says you are building something real with your sewing, Catalina said. I am building something real, Grace agreed, without modesty and without self-consciousness. Good, Catalina said. Men on ranches need wives who are building something. Otherwise they start thinking the ranch is the whole world. Grace looked across the room at Isaiah, who was deep in conversation with Andres and Gareth the foreman about something involving cattle that was clearly interesting to all three of them. And she thought about the way he had said the decisions are ours, and the way he had brought her the indigo blue wool, and the way his heartbeat had been fast on the hill above the ranch. And she felt a warmth so thorough and so settled that it was almost like something you could hold in your hands. By spring of 1883, Grace knew she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Isaiah, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted those 3 days to be her own, to feel the thing that was happening inside her, with the full privacy of her own understanding before it became something shared. She told him on a Sunday morning, while they were having coffee in the kitchen, with the spring light coming through the window and the rosemary pot growing enthusiastically on the sill. He put his coffee cup down very carefully, as if he had been told to handle something delicate. "Grace," he said. "Yes," she confirmed. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down to her eye level in the way he had of making himself physically present without imposing, and he took both her hands and looked at her face with the expression that was too large for any words he had available. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm actually feeling remarkably well, all things considered." "Good." He pressed his forehead against her hands. "Good." She put her free hand on the back of his head and felt the warmth of him and thought about the 37 cents and the cracked boot sole and the 7 miles from the crossroads and the plate of food that had been set down in front of her without a word. And she thought about how you cannot see, when you are walking towards something, what it is you are walking toward. You can only walk and hope that the road has a destination worth reaching. It had a destination worth reaching. The baby came in December of 1883, on a cold, clear night with a full moon throwing blue light through the bedroom window. Isaiah's sister, who had come down from Tennessee when Grace's time drew near, was there, and the doctor's wife, and Mabel Trent, who had ridden out from town and was not going to be talked out of it. Isaiah sat in the kitchen for 4 hours and did not drink the coffee that Mabel brought him because his hands would not stay still enough to hold the cup. The baby was a boy. Isaiah held him in the kitchen doorway with the careful, reverent grip of a man who is holding the most important thing he has ever held. And Grace watched from the bed with her hair down, and her face tired and illuminated with a feeling so entire and so clear that it needed no name. "He needs a name," Isaiah said, coming to sit beside her. "He does," she agreed. They had discussed names over the preceding months without reaching a conclusion, because they were both specific people with specific opinions and because Grace had said you should wait until you see the child before committing, because you might find that the name you had planned does not suit the reality. She looked at the baby, at the red-faced, serious expression of someone very new to everything. "Thomas," she said, and then, before Isaiah could say anything, "Not for my husband, for the name, because it sounds like a person who will know his own mind." Isaiah looked at the baby. "Thomas Holloway," he said. The baby made a small sound. "He agrees," Grace said. "He's 2 minutes old. He has opinions already. I can tell." Isaiah looked at her and smiled, the full, open smile she had seen grow gradually more accessible over the 2 years she had known him, until now it arrived easily and often and was the most reliable landscape feature of her daily life. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they looked at Thomas Holloway, who had shut his eyes again with the thoroughness of someone for whom the world could wait. The following years built themselves one upon another with the particular pleasure of things going well without drama. Thomas grew into a sturdy, observant child who had his father's quietness and his mother's precision, who followed Isaiah around the ranch from the age he could walk, and who had strong opinions about seams when Grace let him sit in the workroom, which she did often, because she saw no reason why a child should not learn the uses of a needle alongside the uses of a saddle. Grace's dressmaking business had by 1885 become substantial enough that she had taken on an assistant, a 16-year-old girl named Clara who showed genuine talent, and who Grace taught with the same direct thoroughness her mother had taught her, because good skills should be passed forward. Isaiah expanded the herd and bought an additional 200 acres that bordered the ranch's eastern edge, and he did both things in full consultation with Grace, whose eye for numbers and whose instinct for timing had, over 3 years of partnership, become as essential to the ranch's operation as anything else in it. He said this to Gareth once, and Gareth, who had been on the ranch long enough to have a clear view of things, said that was obvious, and he was glad Isaiah had figured it out. Their second child came in 1886, a daughter they named Ada, who arrived in the world with immediate and loud opinions about it, and who, by all observable evidence, was going to be a significant person. Thomas, at 2.5, accepted his sister with the serious consideration he gave to all new developments and was observed, on the second day of her life, sitting beside her basket and explaining something to her in the quiet monologue of a very small child convinced of his own expertise. Grace held her daughter and looked at the window through which the late summer light was coming orange and warm, and she thought, not for the first time but with an increasing depth of understanding, about the nature of arriving. She had arrived in Salvation Creek with 37 cents, and a pride that was so fierce and so necessary that it had been both the thing that saved her and the thing that might have kept her too close to be found. She had been hungry in a way she would not speak of, and she had been set a plate of food by a man who had the intelligence and the grace to set it down and walk away, who had given her the dignity of not having to explain herself, who had understood that what she needed was not pity, but simply the practical fact of sustenance offered without strings. And from that plate, from that wordless act, from that walking away, from that precise, generous, perfectly judged thing, all of this had come. She heard Isaiah's step in the hallway, the distinctive pattern of it she could identify in the dark. He came into the room and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at Ada with the expression he had worn when he looked at Thomas, the expression she had no better word for than wonder, which was not a word she had expected to apply to Isaiah Holloway and was now one of the first words she would reach for. "She looks like you," he said. "Thomas looks like you." "Fair distribution," he said. Grace looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something generous with the angles of his face, and his hands were resting on his knees with the stillness she had learned to love, the stillness of a man fully present in the moment he was in. She thought about the first time she had seen him in the red lantern from the corner table, peripheral, a figure she was not looking at but could not quite not notice. She thought about the note about the shirts. "Isaiah," she said, "when you set that plate down in front of me." That first time, at the red lantern, he looked at her, The question she had never directly asked was now in the air between them. "What made you walk away?" she said. Most people would have waited. Most people would have stood there expecting thanks. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Thomas somewhere below the window, talking to Andres about something, his small voice earnest and carrying. The afternoon was settled and warm. "Because," Isaiah said, "you were the most contained person I had ever seen in my life, and I could see exactly what it would cost you to have someone stand there watching you receive something. It would have cost you more than the hunger." He looked at Ada in her arms. "So I didn't stand there." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "That was the smartest thing anyone has ever done for me," she said. "I know," he said without vanity. "I figured it out just before I put the plate down." She laughed, which woke Ada, who expressed her displeasure with the complete vocal commitment of someone who has not yet learned to moderate her feelings and did not particularly intend to. Grace settled her, and Isaiah sat beside them both in the afternoon light, and the house around them was full of the sounds of a life built correctly, from the ground up, on a foundation of genuine things. Salvation Creek grew over the following years. New families came, the rail line extended, a second general store opened, and then a milliner's shop of real substance. And Grace sent Clara to run the milliner's shop when Clara was ready, which required 3 years and a direct conversation in which Grace told her that she was ready and Clara said she was not sure, and Grace said she was sure enough for both of them. Clara ran the milliner's shop with great success, which Grace observed with the particular satisfaction of watching something you planted come up stronger than expected. Isaiah became one of the county's respected voices on grazing and land management, which he attributed to paying attention, and Grace attributed to paying attention, and also to being right most of the time, which he acknowledged was probably both true and connected. Thomas, at 7, fell off his first horse and got back on, which Isaiah watched with the controlled expression of a man managing a complex set of feelings, and Grace watched with the expression of a woman who has decided that controlled fear is preferable to overprotection. Ada, at 4, developed a passion for Rosario's kitchen that Rosario encouraged with evident delight, and the two of them could be found on slow afternoons, conducting what appeared to be serious negotiations about the appropriate amount of chili in a given dish. In 1890, when Thomas was 6 and Ada was 3, Grace received a letter from a woman in Abilene who had known her during the milliner's shop years, informing her that the man who had struck her and driven her from Abilene had come to a bad end through his own decisions and was no longer anyone's concern. Grace read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and sat for a while in the workroom with her hands in her lap. She did not feel the satisfaction she might have expected. She felt something more like the release of a weight she had been carrying so long that she had stopped noticing its presence until it was gone. She showed the letter to Isaiah that evening. He read it and set it down and put his hand over hers on the table and said nothing, which was exactly correct, and she covered his hand with her other hand, and they sat in the kitchen of the H-Bar Ranch house with the lamp burning low and the night quiet outside and the children asleep upstairs. And she felt the past resolve itself into something that was finally, fully finished. Their third child came in 1891, another boy. They named him Eli, after no one in particular but because the name suited him, and he proved from his earliest days to be the most social of the 3 children, the one who wanted to know everyone and be known, who arrived at any room with the energy of a weather event, and left it feeling considerably more alive than before. Isaiah said Eli had come out of somewhere else in the family tree, because neither he nor Grace were like that, and Grace said perhaps that was exactly the point, that children were not supposed to be replicas of their parents, but were instead something new that grew from the conjunction of 2 people who had met in the right place at the right time. The right place being a saloon-eating house in Salvation Creek, Isaiah said. The right place being wherever you happen to be when someone sets a plate of food down in front of you and walks away without demanding anything in return, Grace said. He looked at her across the supper table with Eli on his knee and Thomas and Ada arguing, good-naturedly, about something that had happened at school. The lamp was lit, and the kitchen smelled of the venison stew that Eli had already demonstrated his approval of by getting most of it on his face. Outside, the Texas night was coming in dark and clear and full of stars, the way the nights were out here past the edge of town where the light did not reach. "Is that the story you tell yourself?" he asked. About how this started. She considered him across the supper table, this man she knew the way you know something that has become part of the landscape of yourself. She considered the question with the honesty she always brought to things that mattered. "I tell myself several versions," she said. "The one where I walked into a town and built something from 37 cents and sheer determination. The one where a man who paid attention showed up at the right time with a plate of food. The one where a woman who was too proud to beg and too hungry to refuse learned that those two things held together were not a contradiction but a whole person." She picked up her fork. "I tell myself all of them because they are all true." He held her gaze for a moment with everything he had and everything she was and everything they had built between them on this hill in the Texas hill country. And then Eli grabbed his spoon with both hands and hit the table with it enthusiastically. And Thomas said something to Ada that made her laugh. And the kitchen was full of the particular, irreplaceable sound of a family at supper. "Good," Isaiah said. "All of them are true." And they ate. And the night outside was wide and full of stars, and Salvation Creek lay below the hills in the dark, with its lights going small and steady as always. And the H-Bar Ranch was warm with everything that had been built there over the years, since a woman walked 7 miles through the Texas dust with 37 cents, and a pride fierce enough to keep her upright and a hunger she would not confess, and met a man who understood both of those things without being told, and set a plate down and walked away. They had needed nothing else to begin.